Good afternoon, students, faculty, practitioners, and everyone else, to today's event. We're delighted to have you here for the Architecture and Design for Society 2024 lecture series. So just a bit of information for today's event. This is a recurring academic event that is held monthly, every 1 to 2 sessions each month. The series brings together esteemed speakers from a wide range of disciplines, both nationally and internationally, who will share their expertise, insights, experiences on how design, research can address societal issues and contribute to the betterment of society. For architects and licensed professionals in related fields, this is an excellent opportunity to earn CPD, Continuing Professional Development Points, by registering and attending the lectures. Furthermore, participants can attend more than 80% of the total lectures for this year, 2024, will receive a certificate of completion. This certificate may also be used as part of a credit bank for credit transfer when enrolling in programs at the Faculty of Architecture, Chulalongkorn University. Another point this is to make at this point is we'd also like to use this opportunity to thank our sponsors that you just saw some videos by. We want to express our sincere gratitude to Nippon Paint Decorative Coating Thailand, Sakun Thai Company Limited, and Woodmark Thailand Company Limited for their generous support in making this event possible. So with that out of the way, I would like to invite Professor Sayam Sapsuk, Dean of the Faculty of Architecture, to officially start the event with some opening remarks and a small gift of appreciation to our guests today. Thank you.
So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the third lecture series of this year semester. This is a policy of our school to help sharing the knowledge for us, for every one of us, and for the public to go to the sustainable future together and creating sustainable future for our society in the future. Today, it's our pleasure that we have a special guest, Professor Niall Kirkwood, to be our guest lecturer today. Professor Niall Kirkwood comes from the Graduate School of Design, Harvard University, United States, and this is great honor for us to have him here. And I would like to pronounce that more than that, he will be one of our adjunct professors in the next semester. This is one thing that could be grateful to our university. The topic today, I think he will introduce about the unseen landscape. It's a kind of series of the last year lecture that he already gave us about unnoticed landscape. For example, every time we're thinking about the cultural landscape, we always thinking about the one that have very beautiful things, but that part is only 10% or 20% of our world, and it's only very little in our environment. At the rest of 80%, the unnoticed one would be very important because that is a part of our living. And how could we do with that, and how could we help to improve that? That is the one thing that we need to understand and carry on to help to be in the perfect sustainable future in our societies. So not to waste your time, I think I would like to thank you, Professor Niall Kirkwood, again for being our special guest, and hope everyone have an enjoyable afternoon together. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sayam. So today, a brief introduction of our guests. We are honored to have with us Professor Niall Kirkwood, the Charles Elliott Professor of Landscape Architecture, which the school recognizes his foundational role and service at the Harvard Graduate School of Design for over 36 years. He is also currently serving as Associate Dean for Academic Affairs at Harvard University. Niall has made significant contributions to the landscape architecture and urban design field through his teaching, research, publishing, and professional practice. He previously served as the chair of the Department of Landscape Architecture from 2003 to 2009. leading the oldest landscape architecture program in North America, founded in 1901 by Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. and Arthur Shercliffe. Almost exactly this time last year, he presented his talk, Remade Aspects of Design in an Arduous Landscape, in honor of 90 years of the founding of our faculty. Niall is a familiar face of the faculty and a friend of our faculty. We also are honored and happy that this year, this academic year, Professor Niall will be joining us at INDA as a visiting and exchange scholar during his sabbatical from the GSD. For 3 months, we hope we have a great time together. So without further ado, please welcome Professor Niall Kirkwood.
Probably for the undergraduates only, who are at the beginning of their careers, I suddenly realized when I looked at my resume that I was you in 1974, which is really 50 years ago. And it actually terrifies me. Anyway, let's go forward. I want to really thank the School of Architecture, the Dean, for the invitation to talk to you this evening. But I actually want to acknowledge Chulalongkorn University as a true intellectual partner, a close set of colleagues, and an engaged participant in design education, and I hope in collaboration with the Harvard Design School. Can you work this? I want to go forward. Uh-huh. There's always something. I gotta stop my clock here. I get it 2 extra minutes. Oh, okay, there we go. But can I always, how do I do the next one? Is it this one? Yes. This one, okay. You know, there he goes, but it's, oh. In fact, can I make a suggestion? Can I just say next, and you just do it? Let's get going. I gotta get my timer again. You need to go back one. That's it. Okay. We're off. Yeah. Oh, okay. I'll just say next. Okay. But hold it. So the demilitarized zone, and I'm going to keep referring to DMZ for the title, is the boundary between the Republic of Korea and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Now, you'll notice the Olympics got that mixed up, so I'm going to make it very easy. It's basically, I'm going to just call them South Korea and North Korea, even though that's actually incorrect, but anyway. The zone I'm talking about is about 2.5 miles wide, about 150 miles long. And the key question that I'm going to pose to all of you tonight is, what could this zone be used for during any future period of unification and post-unification? Also, how can landscape design assist in this process? So,
The title, Destroy and Restore, Alternative Nature, Korea DMZ and the Hinterlands, was actually the title also of a course, a GSD course at Harvard that I led, that advanced alternative futures for a unified peninsula through the concerns of landscape design, ecology, and engineering, and explored the spatial forms of unification and the reordering of land resources, ecologies, and identities. And one of the overall themes ranging across the study was the theory and practices of alternate nature. Alternate nature. And this is a term coined not by me, but actually by landscape architects Young Yoon Kim and Yoon Jin Park, and a subject that confronts what I refer to as a non-Western, Western conflict in what are considered the ideas of nature and the natural in the landscape. And this term has now come to mean any spatial artifact in the Korean urban, exurban landscape that evokes both the experience and the function of nature. Next. The initiative studies the transboundary landscapes of the peninsula and its hinterlands that currently divides it into two distinct Koreas. And the DMZ was established at the end of the Korean War as a buffer between two warring armies, respectively 2 kilometers back from the demarcation line. It's not a legal frontier or a legal boundary, as you would know in a country. It's merely a division that's frozen in time by a ceasefire. Now, what is important to know is that in the ceasefire, South Korea never signed the ceasefire, so technically they're still at war. A lot of people don't know that. Next. So, my presentation's really got 10 parts to it. We'll go through some of them quite fast. But I'm going to talk about the idea of boundaries, which of course is a very common topic that we find in the subjects of design and planning. Boundaries. I'll give you a very short overview of the Korean War, not to bore you too much, between 1950 and 1953. I'll talk about the design studio and its place within the GSD at Harvard. I'll talk about some of the things, the assignments in the studio, particularly 4 parts: crossing to safety, remade, field testing, and then fabricating alternate nature, which are the 4 parts of the studio. I'll talk a little bit about the final review. You all know what a final review is, those of you who are in design studies. And then I'll talk about a little postscript, i.e. what has happened since and what is happening now. Next, please. So let's start with boundaries. Design investigations address the erasure or the redrawing of boundaries in many cases, the concerns of population displacement, the evolution of new infrastructure, and the issue, in this case, of live mine removal and contaminated soil remediation, all within a reimagined role for military bases, forests, farms, and landscape. Next, please. The study area cuts across the 38th parallel, including the military demarcation line, the joint security area. I won't get too technical in all these various lines and boundaries, but they're all between the 2 Koreas. Next, please. This is actually quite an interesting drawing because these 3 landscapes are all drawn at the same scale. And I think it betrays really the scale and size of the demilitarized zone. The central part, New York, 900 acres, is right at the top. That looks like a mark on the slide, okay? This is Yosemite National Park in the United States, and at the same scale as the demilitarized zone. So the first thing you can probably establish right away is it's not an insignificant piece of land. It's quite large, but it has a very particular form. It's long and thin, like a snake going across. Next. The total area of the peninsula itself, and this is the whole Korean peninsula, is about 220,000 square kilometers. It has about 76 million population, 1/3 in the north, 2/3 in the south, and it's about predominantly mountainous terrain over between 65 and 70% of the entire country. People don't always know that, and it's probably why they're dependent on imported goods for agriculture. They have very little land because most of the country, the peninsula, is actually mountains. But it also plays into their cultural understanding of their country. Next, please. There we go. Many commentators. Now, first of all, I don't come to this subject completely originally. Many people, many writers, many journalists, many observers, many planners have looked at the demilitarized zone for many reasons over many times. But many commentators have viewed the zone, as part of a rich ecological paradise. And I'll talk a little bit about that. Post-unification proposals have been put forward to preserve it as a park for climate adaptation, a world nature reserve, or as a venue for peace memorials. Simplistic preservation, though, is really difficult to accept because it's the location of a damaging environmental and military exploitation over the last 70 years. It looks somewhat rich and romantic, but is actually kindly dangerous. Next. And these include live minefields. There's about 3 million mines in this area, landmines in the ground. Infiltration tunnels where the North Koreans dug to South Korea. There's 3 major ones, at least we know of. Security sensors, electrified fences, abandoned and reauthorized army bases within a network of agriculture, village agriculture, and war tourism. It is a very, very strange place indeed. And it's the kind of place that I like, actually. I'm attracted to. Next. Large-scale disturbances happen to vegetation, and multiple grassland scars or burn scars are linked not to some form of ecological operation, although they are. It's actually to do with surveillance. They're burned by the military to keep the vegetation down so they can see forward. And they do that on both sides. So there's constantly fires, smoke kind of drifting across it. Next. However, the zone is more than a blunt physical boundary. It limits, in the psyche of the Koreans and others, it limits imagination. It limits empathy and connection for all those involved in the political and the economic unification processes. So what I'm trying to suggest as planners and designers here in the audience, both students and teachers, is it isn't just a kind of planning, a site planning exercise to be solved. It actually goes much deeper into both the culture and the psyche of the people on both sides. Next. There we go. And through design practices, it's proposed that the unification of the Korean Peninsula, and you notice I keep referring to the Korean Peninsula, the thing itself, the landmass, rather than the 2 individual countries, can be initiated by the territorializing and re-inhabitation of the region, including the DMZ and its hinterlands, the land either side around the military debarkation line. This is kind of what it looks like. You'll see some slides that I took when I was in there. You know, it's just quite a strange place. Next. And redefining initially the concerns of military security. Again, I'm not being so naive to suggest that security doesn't exist, and I'll talk about that. Access, infrastructure, programs, identities. And you can probably see that I broke the rules because I did photograph facility equipment illegally. This is all debris left over by the military from the 50s, but actually into the 70s and 80s. It's bunkers, munitions, stuff. Next. So, a new set of boundaries for the DMZ and the hinterlands can be designed, shaped by the landscape and ecologies of an alternate nature, rather than imposed through political or military will as before. So the left-hand map there is a very simple map. It's a map most landscape architects start with, actually most planners start with, which is the underlying geology, the geologic terrain of the country. Remember, I did say it was 65–70% mountainous. And you can see the different allocations in terms of rock formation, etc., up and down the peninsula. The right-hand map illustrates the peninsula united by the mountains as a single landform. Now, what is interesting, in both of these maps, the DMZ boundary doesn't appear anywhere. It's quite deliberate. And there is no logic for you as the audience of where you're going to find the DMZ. I mean, you can do a little exercise, and which I do with my students, which is with a felt pen, draw where the DMZ is. No one really gets it right. It's either too far south, too far north. And that's the whole point. The point is that the DMZ is this very strange, illogical thing that is betrayed by the ecology and logic of the landscape of the peninsula. So we'll keep going. Next. So the study started by carrying out historical and ecological analysis to identify elements of the geological and geographical as a framework to understand the zone. I've spent a lot of time in Korea. I lived there in 2010 at Korea University, and I spent a lot of time hiking in the mountains, and so I kind of know it. I know it okay. I'm definitely an outsider, a foreigner. But one of the things I can say, I spent a lot of time studying both the way Koreans map their own landscape and the proliferity of paintings from the 16th, 17th, 18th century of the mountains and the rivers, the mapping of the mountains. It enters into their psyche, and I'm going to talk about that when we talk about Park Kim's ideas of alternate nature. But these are just some imagery for you to see. The bottom left one actually is the city of Seoul in 1920. It's a walled city. This is the north of Han River. It's quite a nice photograph. Anyway, let's keep going. So next, please. Alternate nature, let me just talk about that for a few minutes, is a technique and a tool that was studied in relationship to other earlier models of planning, usually Western, and then applied as an extension of these models. Let me say very quickly, I know Young Kim has been here. Maybe she gave a lecture here. It's not my idea, I have to be very clear. Alternate nature came from the work of her and her husband, Yoon-jin Park. But it's in response to a kind of proto-Western way it was taught in Korean schools of discovering how Koreans understand nature and how they understand the idea of non-Western nature. And I'll talk a little bit about what that means. Alternate nature addresses the limitations of space in Korea. Remember I said that 65–70% of Korea is mountainous, which means there's very little space to do things, to grow crops, to build. And how designers in Korea have reacted to that context they're working in, the limit of space. Historically, Korean citizens, and when I mean historically, I mean way back, that 15th, 16th century, they went directly to the mountains and rivers to be in nature. Okay? They left their homes, their hanoks, and they went up and they climbed the mountains because the mountains are so close. If you've been to Seoul, I don't know, somebody maybe have lived in Seoul or are from Seoul, you know that you can be up in the mountains in like 25 minutes. You take the subway there. You go to Acha, Mount Acha. You go by subway. So you'll actually on a Sunday morning, you'll be in a subway full of people kitted out in hiking gear. Usually very expensive hiking gear with poles and backpacks because they can get to the mountains very quickly. So they go to the mountains, and they also go to the rivers to be at nature. And they don't use what we would call in the West a middle landscape. They don't use gardens and parks or invented parks as the mediation with nature. They go direct to nature. So Koreans, although there are things that look like parks there, actually have no concept of park. Which of course I find funny because it's the most common surname, but that's a whole other thing. And they don't use invented parks or plazas to work with the natural world. They want to go direct. Olmsted Central Park, for example, that I showed you earlier, is a perfect example of the imported Western model of a middle landscape that stands in for natural environment, which is so far away, whether a mountain, a river, a coast, a lake. And I've even seen here in Thailand that the idea of park, Bangketi Park, the new park that's here, is being criticized because the Thai understanding of why do we need a park when we have access to nature, we have access to the rivers, we have access to the highlands. So here are some kind of definitions developed by Park and Kim for alternate nature. They call it revealed nature, spot nature, memory nature. And you can see here, you may think this isn't nature. This seems like some aberration. Chunga Chunga stream here. That's the Senyudo renovation of a wastewater treatment plant. Even the idea of the plastering on walls of something that is meant to look like natural, but it isn't. Next. Or actually interiorized nature. They call this nature. It's very interesting, interiorized nature, where you go to the shopping mall. This is Coex, if you're in Jamsil, or nearer to Gandam, if you know it. And they actually have these amazing imagery of natural things. And I get really kind of messed up by this kind of stuff, because to me it's kind of like Disneyland. But they're very serious about this stuff. Anyway, let's keep going. Next slide, please. So the ambition is not simply the preservation of local ecologies, whether in the mountainous terrain or informing one-off design interventions. It's an opportunity here, through the Park Kim work, to conceive new forms of landscapes after unification, where nature and the natural can be reinterpreted on the peninsula. Next. Now, I did say that this is a broader topic. In Korean art, and particularly graphics, which I'm very interested in, their calligraphy, but their painting, they were introduced as a kind of source of inspiration for advancing conceptual forms and methods of representation. But the artists themselves have been focused on these topics for many, many years. For example, this is a painting by a contemporary artist called Byung Mun, titled Slow \Same, Slow Same. And it's a landscape. And there's a whole body of work of landscape painting. Now you say, well, yes, it's kind of a landscape. I can kind of see what he's doing with it. But this is one type of work that is happening in parallel artistic and aesthetic fields, kind of working away. And you'll find that the Korean artists now, actually I saw some of them in Europe, are doing exquisite work on studying landscape through art or film. And the qualities here about natural reflection, the idea of repetition, and the idea of vastness. This could go on and on and on. Next. So let's move on to part two. This is a very short overview. This is your history lesson. For those of you who don't know much about the Korean War, it's actually known as the Forgotten War, because very few people actually know about it. It happened at a time and a place involving 17 different countries, but actually it's little known about. It happened 1950 to 53, so it was after the Second World War, after the Japanese annexation, and it resulted literally in our topic tonight, the demilitarized zone. Next. I won't go into the long history of why it happened. It's about polarity in political ideologies with Korea after independence from Japan, and some troubles with China to the north. But it brought on a war that involved and brought in opposing forces, well, from the United Nations, including the United States, Canada, etc., and European countries, and China and what then became North Korea. So next, I want to try and explain very briefly in this map. The next graphic. Next. Just advance it. Yeah. Okay, this is the map. This is all you need to know about the war, okay? And you read left to right. It's basically a dance up and down the peninsula. And it's quite bizarre because there are times and periods where you think it could have all ended just very quickly. So the first map on the left, the North Korean troops invaded across the 38th parallel, and they went all the way down to Busan in the south. You can just see the little green part right at the end. So that was entirely the North Koreans, all the way down, okay? After 2 months, they were, the Allies and the South Koreans were almost defeated. They were just holding on in Busan. And then in September, more forces came at Incheon and cut off the North Korean troops. And then they invaded North Korea, so they marched all the way back up in the second map, almost into China, which people don't remember. It was actually close to actually invading China at the time. But the Chinese People's Volunteer Army and map 3 crossed back over again and pushed back down, and UN forces retreated, and there was a spring offensive, and the final 2 years they were fighting over 200 yards, back and forth, just a tiny, like this. That is a terrible, quick description of the war, and I've left out a lot. But if you were in Seoul, you realize Seoul was invaded back and forth many, many times, and was almost all destroyed, almost. And then it all ended at the DMZ, at the armistice line. So in a sense, they kind of came back, they finished where they started. So it was kind of a war that killed 2.5, 3 million people, but actually achieved very little. That's my interpretation. Other people will disagree with that. An armistice was signed in July '53. The prisoners were exchanged, and they created the DMZ. Next. Now, it noted that representatives signed the armistice. There was a displacement of Korean civilians. This is very interesting. I talked to some people in Korea about this. People were on the wrong side of the line. People who had family in what is now South Korea were stuck on the north, and people in the south had family in the north and couldn't get back. So they had to do this massive armistice of exchange of people back and forth, and unfortunately also refugees. So next time you think about the Koreans and you listen to K-pop, you get your Samsung phone. This is a time when Korea was the second poorest country in the world because of this devastation of the war. Next. So, as a result, the Armistice Agreement was founded. We had the northern and the southern parts, although technically we shouldn't call them north and south. And they withdrew their armies. So here we are, and this is actually them setting out the DMZ. They're literally, on both sides, are making sure it's in the correct alignment. It's quite strange. This is sort of a surveying of the DMZ. Next. It also became heavily fortified, and they started laying landmines. These are for personal landmines, not for vehicles, actually for people, to stop people moving back and forth. It also was covered with a network of surveillance of cameras, motion sensors, and other things. Next. So the accompanying zone between the two countries is really a network of fortifications, of infrastructure, of guards, fences, tunnels, forests, estuaries, and wetlands, because at the same time, the landscape that existed there started to revive in its kind of own way. Also abandoned military infrastructure. This is some of the stuff I photographed when I was there. Next. And as I said, proposals have been put forward for the DMZ for, even since the 1960s. It's been going on and on, as a national park, nature reserve. There's even the revegetation has happened as the vegetation has regrown after being demolished and blown up. Next. One place, you've probably seen this image, or you maybe been there. This is Panmunjom. This is the place where the two countries come together. This is the United Nations hut where they do exchange, the blue huts. I had a chance to go in here with the head of the Korean military, General Kim, who's a really scary individual. These guys are really interesting. You see these guards, the ones on the corners of the buildings? They're not just standing there arbitrarily. They're not just there for fun, They have no weapons. Notice their hands, notice their fists. They're like this. They're third Dan black belt taekwondo. They're trained in martial arts, hand-to-hand fighting, and their job, and they have friends on the other side. That's North Korea you're looking at. And if someone rushes the line and puts one foot into South Korea, they will fight, they will attack to pull the person over, but they won't shoot, they won't stab, they can have to do it hand to hand. So they only do 30-minute rotations because they're so tense. They're kind of like this. They're kind of just ready to fight. Of course, and nothing happens for months. So that's what's going on there. Next. So discussions still take place. I mean, in a sense, this is not kind of an abandoned place. This is actually very active. There's lots of things going on in the landscape in these buildings where the people come in from either end of the building and they meet in the middle at the table on either side and they negotiate things. I'm going to tell you a very short story. I know I might go over time. I was with, I think he's Brigadier General Kim. He is, now why am I a humble professor with the head of the Korean military? Well, as always, it always gets down to students. I was teaching a class at Korea University, and one of the students said, well, what do you do? What are you doing? What are you going to go and do? When after classes, are you going to go and look at museums? I said, I want to go to the DMZ, but I'll probably try and get a tour. And a young lady in the front row put her hand up, and she said, my father will take you. And this is quite common. They're very generous, and I didn't really think much of it. He said, and she did a quick thing in the phone, and then she said, he'll pick you up on Sunday at 10 o'clock. Okay. So it's a little curious because it's not open on Sunday. So at 10 o'clock, I was outside the faculty dorms, the faculty housing at Korea University, and a car pulls up, and a man gets out dressed as though he's going to play golf. In other words, he's not. He has a polo shirt, and he's very pleasant, and the student is there. And we get in, and we drive north, and there's no cars on the road. And as we get further north, remember the DMZ is 1 hour north of Seoul. It's very close. We start to see tanks, we start to see guys with big guns, and we keep going, and going, and going, and going. And we get to the kind of tourist area where you stop, where you see the video. There's no one else there. And at this point, I'm very curious, but I'm also very nervous. I have no idea what's going on. And he opens the car door, or the car door is open for him, and the car is surrounded by soldiers, armed soldiers. These guys with the helmets, the sunglasses, and you can't quite see their face. They're sort of looking. I think they're looking. And he gets out the car, and everybody stands to attention and salutes. And I thought, at that point, I know something is up. Something is up. So I say to the student, I say, oh, what does your father do? He said, oh, he's in charge of the whole Korean military, and he's the world's expert on North Korea. Aha, I said, okay, that's good. Maybe I should do a studio. And so he takes me, we see a video, we see all that kind of stuff. I get a t-shirt and all this. And then he says, let's go. So we go back to where the blue huts were, and he takes my arm. This is very Korean. You know, he kind of takes my arm and just takes me right to the front. And he just says to me, don't smile, don't wave, don't wink, don't show any emotion, just stand there. And it's midday in Sunday in the summer in Korea. It's hot, it's like Bangkok. You know. So I'm really starting to get nervous because about 50 feet, 40 feet away are North Korean guards with guns right on us, okay? And he says, very slowly move your head to the right. So I'm kind of going like this. And I said, what do you see? I said, I see a guard tower, and there's two men, they have kind of officer hats. You know, I know they're not just general soldiers, and they look very angry. They look very angry. They're pointing and they're shaking their heads. And he says, you know why they're doing that? I said, no. Did we do something wrong? You know, I said, no. They know who I am. I'm here all the time. They know who I am. They've gone on the internet and they've done a face recognition scan of you. And they want to know why a professor of landscape architecture from Harvard GSD in the US is standing beside the head of the Korean military. And based on his haircut or lack of care, maybe he's military himself or CIA. And they have to report to their bosses, their officers above them, of this person who was observing them, and they're nervous because they might get into trouble. And I said, well, but I am what I say I am on the internet, you know. I'm not CIA, I'm not military. In fact, it's the last thing I'm to do. And he says, it's okay. I do it as a joke. I'm just playing with them. I'm jerking their chain, which is an expression. He just wanted to kind of annoy them. And unfortunately, he used me to kind of annoy them. So that was my DMZ. That was one story, particularly with the North Koreans, that I was using. He set me up to kind of annoy the North Koreans. But the rest of the trip, we were okay. They were watching us all the time. But clearly, maybe in the end, they thought I was studying the landscape. Maybe. Anyway, that's just a little aside. There are many stories. But that was one time, and then the other time that you'll see in some of the slides when I actually got into the DMZ, which is elite. You know, I went in with the Korean government in a jeep, avoiding the landmines, and that's why some of the photographs are able to be taken, because I was actually literally in the zone. We were about 1 kilometer from North Korea, on a jeep. Anyway, the life of the academic. On we go. Next slide. So that's all happened in that little map there. Next. This is interesting. This is a long contested boundary. And I find this whole thing both ironical and actually kind of funny. Funny in a good way, not funny in a ha-ha way. In the end, the boundary between two warring countries is a small, thin curb of poured concrete. That's the boundary. I'm sorry to let you down. Sorry it's not a massive fence, 100 feet high, covered in barbed wire. It actually is that. And what I find interesting as a landscape architect is that the drainage detail goes through it. So the water that lands in North Korea goes through to South Korea to drain. And these are just these strange ironies. Now, what you're seeing here, of course, is officials from the north, who you'll recognize by the communist badge, the lady, the various officials, and they're shaking hands with the official from the south, and they're each standing respectively on either side of the curb. They're not allowed to kind of poop, 1 foot on another. So that's the reality. I think it's absolutely amazing. In the end, it's a very humble landscape detail of concrete that literally is the true line, which I think is kind of funny. Next. Let's keep moving here, because I'm rambling a little bit. Next slide, please. So let's go right into the studio. It really just, I'm going to kind of quickly describe the studio. You've kind of got the wind up a little bit, so let's next slide, please. For those of you in design programs, a lot of this will be very familiar. This is actually Yoon Kim and I presenting the studio to students, at the beginning of the semester, where they have an ability to choose one of 16 studios. Those of you who went to the GSD will recognize this very, very clearly. It was fairly popular, and we got about 14 students to join us for the studio. So, next. These are my co-instructors. This is on the left, sitting down, Yoon Kim, who I know is probably a visitor here, and her husband, Yoon Park, standing. They're both trying to look very cool, dressed in black, They're based in Seoul, Korea. Their company is Park Kim, which I think is funny because it's the 2 most common names in Korea. It's like Brown Smith, they just Park Kim. They're actually both my former students, and they completed the MLA program at the GSD in 2002. And I like to think, and I won't make too much of a point about it, and it doesn't follow on to other studios, they actually met in a studio that I ran in 2001. They both went to the same school, they grew up in the same district in Gandam, and they didn't know each other. And they met in my studio, and they're now married for many years and have a daughter called Jane. Anyway, I don't offer that when you do my studios. I don't do a marriage ceremony, marriage kind of advice at the same time. But anyway, so next, studio structure. Let's talk about the assignments. Just to kind of structure it, you don't have to read that, but basically, the first part I'm calling crossing to safety, which is this idea of the legacy of planning and design and its contribution to define borders. Borders are a very interesting device, a line on a map, a line on paper that define one side or another, the layout of complex land. So there was a study of boundaries. The second is the idea of the reordering, regeneration of the DMZ from a whole series of multiple points. Not just geologic and science, but also cultural and artistic. Next, field testing. The students go to the site, which is part of at least half of the studios at the GSD. We take them there, it's sponsored, and so they get the chance to go test out ideas and then alter and amend them after looking at the site. Now you realize I did put up some slides of Harvard writing to me saying that I was not allowed to take the students to the DMZ, but I managed to convince them with a lawyer that I was not taking them into a place that they were not, it was safe. Yeah, well, maybe. Sometimes. And then fourthly, the idea of developing proposals based on alternate nature. So again, it's not particularly complex. The idea also that a remade demilitarized zone in the middle of the peninsula would actually do something for a reunited Korea, because it would redress disparities of resources, ecological connectivity, and cultural identity. Next. Oh, it's gone. And so articulating really the multiplicities of nature as a specific form. So let's keep going. Next. For those of you who have never seen North Korea, that's what it looks like. Kind of just looks like part of South Korea. Everything slightly to the right of the slide is south, everything to the left is north. Okay? Yeah, it kind of just looks the same. It's actually quite different. But the systems of vegetation are the same, the hydrology is the same, it flows together, the soils are the same, but everything else, particularly cultural and human, is different. And that line there is actually the demilitarized zone. The line, the demarcation line, you can track it. Next. So let's start crossing to safety. Okay, off we go. So working with groups, the instructors and students define ideas of security, border, and identity. One of the first things they found is as soon as they put a mark on the map, it actually defined and actually limited their study. That's the problem with boundaries. So the boundaries in very early started not to become lines, but became areas, zones, shading, and they were struggling with graphic representation of how to represent something that wasn't just lines, which don't really appear on the ground because they're really concrete upstands. So they started with geological boundaries, next, and then we introduced 7 topics. Next slide, thanks. Next time I'm bringing my own laptop. Okay. We introduced 7 topics. Again, none of these for you guys should be quite difficult. I mean they're obvious. The regional boundaries, go back one. Ecological boundaries, geopolitical boundaries, spatial boundaries, symbolic and spiritual boundaries, and we'll kind of get into that. It's slightly different. Environmental risk and the idea of cultural. What do we mean by that? So we're giving themes to the students to explore, in addition to their own interests. Next. So there's kind of regional boundaries here in plan images and also in section. And again, it's about the limits of graphic representation as much as anything, of how you represent this. Next. Ecological boundaries were mapped, and again, that's a little easier, showing integration of topography, wildlife, vegetation, moisture regimes, exposure from sun and soil. Next, and then geopolitical. Next, I'll go through this one. Then we came across this. This is kind of curious. When you do research, all of you do research of different types. Faculty do research. And you come across something that is so totally mind-blowing that you can't understand why no one ever found it before. It's an old box. I seem to kind of like boxes, but it's actually a map. It's a large-scale map of Korea produced in the Joseon Dynasty period by a cartographer and a geologist called Kim Jong-ho in 1861. It is the oldest map of Korea. It's in sections, so you have to fold them out. There's only 2 copies in the world. One is in the vaults in the museum in Seoul, and for some reason, Harvard University has one in the Yangqing Library of Asian Studies. Now, why do we have one? Well, it's a long story, but I'll cut it real short. When the Japanese invaded Korea in 1910, scholars moved material from Korea to the United States and to Harvard Library for safekeeping. And they never gave it back. We've done this for many hundreds of years. We actually have Russian bells that we took from St. Petersburg when the Tsar was still, which were actually hung in Leverett House on the river. So this is actually both good and bad, but the idea things are moved out of the country for safekeeping. And so we actually happen to have one. I had a Korean TA, teaching assistant. I told him to go down, and I had ordered the book, to get it out. We had to take it out for like 3 days. I sent him down to the library to pick up the book for Professor Kirkwood. He didn't quite know what he was going down to pick up, and so he took a plastic bag from a supermarket, okay, and because that's all he had. He didn't have a backpack, and so he came back carrying one of the most precious documents of the Korean culture and country in a Tesco, in a super. I don't know what it was. It's probably Market Basket or something. A shopping bag And he was so nervous, he was shaking, because he was holding one of the historic treasures of his country. And he still couldn't believe it. He was shaking. He said, I don't believe what this is. I don't believe what this is. Anyway, next. It's quite remarkable. The cartographer, this is a private map that was made. It has all the rivers, the mountains, the villages, the topography. And we've got a lot of incredible information from it. There is unfortunately a bad story because he did it and because it was not asked for by the king, or the emperor at the time. He was executed for doing the map because he considered that he was giving away information about the country that could be used by the enemies. So just be careful what you do, guys. Anyway, just as a little aside in our research. So we spent quite a lot of time looking at this map, and then we, of course, folded it back and gave it back to the library, where it still resides today. Next. So in the second assignment, remade, the regeneration of DMZ territory and its relationship to the hinterlands was studied with alternate nature. So let's go to the next slide. I'll speed up a little. So the post-unification refers to all activities occurring within the future technological, cultural, ecological society. In addition to manufacturing and production that's been located in the DMZ, still and ongoing studies of ecological richness arising from the absence of significant human presence. This is the one strange thing about the DMZ. Because it is so dangerous, because it is so secure, very few people are there. Just some local farmers, some tourists, some people like me. So actually the ecology has flourished. And here, Young Ruk An, he's one of my students again in GSD on the right. That's his father, who's actually owns a restaurant and is an engineer. And in his part-time, he studies the ecology of the area. So that's why he's, being at the kind of security fence with binoculars and a camera isn't always a good idea in case he gets shot. But he's been recording wildlife, particularly bird life and insect life. And he has long, so we managed to get more data. So we have the data of the old maps, we have the data from Young Ruk An. Next. And we kind of defined 4 areas. One was the idea of dark tourism. Dark tourism is a kind of strange idea, and I'll talk about what that means. Energy valleys is another, agricultural management, and individual study topics from the students themselves, including wild former tiger habitats, because believe it or not, the Korean tiger used to exist, or maybe it still exists. Well, we'll find out. This is the idea of a real or imagined animal that they believe. Next, dark tourism. Dark tourism is a term for travel to places historically associated with tragedy or human grief. Now, why on earth would you want to do that? Well, some people do. And the attraction to this location is their historical value rather than association with death or suffering. And the DMZ happens to be one of these places people want to visit. Chernobyl, until the recent war with Russia, was another place. I actually wanted to do a studio in Chernobyl where the nuclear meltdown was. The camps in Germany during the Second World War is another place. I mean, you can see there are places in Cambodia, some of the camps. In other words, there are places that certain types of people, certain interests want to visit for their association and their history. And it has a term, dark tourism. Next. One of the students became absolutely fascinated by this. And she started to study not just where the mines were. By the way, the 3 million mines, they're not mapped. People don't quite know where they are. That's the first thing. To date, of the 3 million mines, only 134 mines have been cleared. And it costs $1 million to clear 134 mines. You can imagine 3 million. It's going to take a long time. But this approach became very interesting to tourists and local visitors. And so, as I said, local locations of dark tourism, Chernobyl, Second World War camps, Poland, etc. It does actually generate quite a lot of resources and money. People pay a lot of money to go to these things. I don't totally understand it. Next. And the dark tourism would use the unique geology and ecology of the area and the remnants of the battle ruins. This is me in the DMZ. My hand is shaking a little bit at the camera. What you're looking at are tank traps. These were built by the US military, and I had to learn. They're made of concrete. And you see these big concrete blocks at the top. When the North Korean tanks would come through, they put charges, explosives, under the blocks. They blow them, and the big blocks fall and crush the tanks and the people in them, or at least block the route. So they're called tank traps. They're still there. These are from the 1950s, and you don't want to really walk under them because it's a little bit scary. The concrete is crumbling. And the explosives have been taken out, but even so, they could still fall on you and do serious damage. So this sort of stuff is just lying all over the place. Next. So since the sites of dark tourism are relatively tiny and scattered, it doesn't actually require so much investment and number of sites at the beginning. So it's the idea of revenue from this. This is the student's project, not my idea. This is her project. Could fund the general landmine clearance, get the land prepared for other development. She thinks it could be accomplished in 50 years. And it's a temporal program for the region that aims to truly dissolve the physical buffer zone towards unification. Next, agricultural management aims at improving food security as part of the unification and resulting landscape. The connected agricultural zones can be reformed as a main agricultural zone of the entire peninsula, which is very short of land. It has to import a lot of food, both from Taiwan, China, and a little bit from Japan, but they don't like doing that. Also, the northern part of the peninsula is steeper than the south, and so the soils are quite different. Next. This is the study. This is, again, it's a kind of complex map, but it's actually about the most specific, the better soils, the better insulation, open for sun, for water, etc. That is done over the area. Next, looking at 2 agricultural zones, one in the north, one in the south. Next, and 2 types of management, both what called plain agricultural fields and terrace fields, to deal with the steeper sites. And for plain agriculture, using the existing natural zones filled with rainwater. These are cleared of mines, so these are safe. This, in fact, is, everyone know what that crop is? See how good you are. This is a high-value crop. No, ginseng. Because it needs that canopy, it has to protect from the sun. But the ginseng roots, each one could sell for about $100. And so farmers use ginseng as a place of great, making, if they can't put corn and things, they use ginseng. And then for next slide, and for terraced, again, this is a piece of the east of Korea. The idea of agricultural fields using much more traditional methods, some of which you use here, in terms of flooding for rice and for corn. And there's a whole kind of strategy developed about slope and things. Next. And then energy. An essential factor affecting urban development is the need for affordable energy, and it's of course disparate across the peninsula. Next. This is a satellite photograph of the Korean peninsula at night. I don't think it takes much to work out where the DMZ is, because everything to the south, Seoul is that blinding light, you know, and everything just go up a little north and it's absolute, almost total darkness. I mean, that is one form of looking at the two countries. And so there's a clear boundary of lack of energy, abundant energy, dividing north and south. And the idea, now, assumptions are made about unification. What has to happen? Well, maybe there's an overthrow, maybe they're the army, maybe they're, you know, Kim Jong-un suddenly just dies one day or whatever, or his daughter dies as well. Who knows? It's not for me to say. But I know in some time you have to plan that one day there will be unification of some type. Next. There's also, through energy, hydroelectric. What is it I find curious about the two countries, and I'm a little over time, so I'll finish soon, is the water for South Korea comes from the north. It's very strange. All the water sources from the north and goes right through the DMZ and then flows into the south. And of course, the North Koreans have been damming the rivers to kind of control, to get some energy from it, but also to control the water supply. So it's the irony. It's like my little drainage detail at the right at the DMZ. The rainfall from one country goes into the other and then goes into the drain. It's bizarre. Next. And so the project here is to reunify the peninsula from the perspective of energy, removing threatening dams, restoring local water systems, etc. Next, and the most strange one here, the ghost tiger habitat. As a product of the Korean War, the ground on which the zone was established remains deeply scarred by infrastructural security and decades of cultural separation. And this proposal, next slide, seeks to explore reunification. This is not his drawing, this is a historic drawing from Korea, as a state of wild transition, mediated between the Bakdu-Daegan mountain range, and the DMZ is reconceptualized as really more a porous territory of cultural, material, and ecological change. The idea, this is what's known as a third state. There was a Korean tiger. They did exist. They were probably hunted to extinction, although there are claims that they're still seen. These are tigers, like you'd see in India or Africa. But I think this graphic is kind of interesting because it actually is the peninsula, with it's biting into, actually very close to what is Russia up there, China. And so this student was just fascinated with this idea of the mystery of this ghost animal, and could you actually kind of use it as a device to reunify the landscape, to prepare certain types of spaces. And he read a lot about Buddhism, he read about kind of Korean culture, Korean history, as through the lens of the animal, the symbolism of the animal. Next. So the new wild, and again, this doesn't look like much to do with tigers. He did a lot of mapping of the mountains where they would be found, and kind of the idea of a new wild as a type of alternate nature. Let's leave it at that. Let's go to the next. Next. Then we had a mid-review. I don't need to explain what a mid-review is to this group. Next, in which there's our map again. The work was kind of presented again. Next. You can actually just see some of the students putting their work up. This is about mid-review, so week 7, week 8. Next. And we had a kind of discussion with Korean experts at Harvard and designers about the work and where the students should go after that. Next. Well, where they went actually is they went to Korea. So we did a field trip. Next. Here they are at Incheon Airport, all looking kind of tired, and there's Uni on the left-hand side welcoming them. All look kind of happy-ish. Next. Here we are driving to the DMZ, and you can start to see the yellow spiky barriers that you start to see on the roads. We're heading north. We're heading to the DMZ. Next. And here we are right on the line. This is the observatory. These are binoculars. We're looking right into North Korea. And the students are, what are they doing? I guess they're looking through the binoculars. They're trying to see people and wave to them on the other side. There's a lot of that stuff goes on. And they're at the Dora Observatory, if you've been there, which is a viewing platform to allow you to see into North Korea. And they're actually watching North Korean soldiers moving around just below there. Next. Now, just to remind you that this is a restricted area, and this is the reality of the large number of mine zones, and surveys have been carried out by both sides of the military, but not completely, so they don't quite know where the... So next, here's Matthew. This is our ghost tiger guy, okay? But here he is. He's looking very casual here. He's looking very well-dressed. The sign that's just to his left is past mine zone. And if you believe the sign, he actually survived, but you have to be careful when you see signs like that. Is it really a past mine zone, or is there still mines there? Anyway, as you move eastward, next slide, this is what the DMZ looks like as you go east. Everything's kind of nice on the west. It's all kind of fertile. It's all quite nice. But it gets higher and it gets actually bleaker. And that's snow on the ground, okay? So the idea of a boundary between two countries at this point is kind of strange because there's nobody there. And the sentry duties we were on the south side, of course. The soldiers were so glad to see us because they literally don't see people for months. And they're guarding, you know, they're mostly young soldiers. They're required military service. They're probably 18, 19, 20. They just don't want to be there. They're miserable. They're cold. And they was happy because we had some ladies in our class, so they could chat to them, you know. But can cheer them up a little bit. And then, because we had to move on. But I wanted to show you the idea that the length of the DMZ is not uniform in terms of type. It really, to the east, goes very mountainous, very high, and it kind of looks like that. Next. I mean, you can even see, they're wearing these big coats, you know, the kind of winter coats. And it's not winter, even though there's snow. Next. What we did when we got back to Seoul, we met, and I do this each time, we met with members of the GSD Alumni Association in Korea. And next, we had another crit. We represented all the work to Korean landscape architects, and planners. Next. So let's go to the last part. The final section concerned with really schematic designs the students did. I'll go through this quite quickly. Next. This is Jae-Wee Chen. I actually want to make sure you know these people, you know, just actually see them. Here she is. In the NLA program, who used land design approaches as a medium to help the process of unification of infrastructure. This is the dark tourism lady, okay? So you can actually put a face to the person. Her project called Korea 50. Next. And she basically took the idea and worked it through as a complete landscape project. For the rest, the 4 or 5 weeks. Next, developing representations, perspectives, plans, and actually worked out the financial part of it as well. Okay. Next. Next. Just to show you which training. This is Anne Salerno. Again, in the same studio. Anne. Did a whole project on surveillance. The idea of surveillance and view sheds, which we in landscape architecture love talking about and working with, but also the alliance to military surveillance. And the idea that they're actually both the same thing. And she kind of worked with moving a military surveillance into a landscape surveillance view shed. That's her. That's her model behind. It's quite good. It's a model of the peninsula, 3D model. Next. And then, you know, she did kind of work on, I won't spend too much time on this, about kind of shaping view sheds, shaping vegetation. Next. Next. And did a whole series, very kind of, actually, for someone who's a Westerner, who's American, did a kind of set of drawings that were very Eastern or very Korean in a sense, a kind of sequential set of sections and drawings, very influenced by Korean painting. Next. And the art, which we saw before. Next. Then we had a final review. I don't need to explain what a final review is to you guys, just to show you. Next. The drawings are represented back. Next. There she is again. So you've seen her dark tourism at the beginning, the middle, and at the end. And she completed her project. The reason I'm showing this is because there's something at the end that you'll see. Next. Some of the drawings. Next. This is Guran. Next. There's Anne presenting. Next. Next. There's the studio. Everyone looks happy because it's over. Now, for about 3 minutes, I just want to talk about what happened after. Next. Next. Okay, postscript. Next. In the imitable fashion we all do, I did a book, and so the work of the students is available in this book. I'm happy to share it with anybody. I've actually run out of printed copies, but I have the PDF. If you want it, I have it with me. So that in itself is not unusual, and we gave this copies of this to the South Korean government and different organizations. I gave it to the General Kim. No one from North Korea, agency, individuals, would accept it. We tried to write to them, but they didn't want it. Okay. Well, next, in true academic fashion, I wrote an article for the Chinese Landscape Architecture magazine on the studio and on the work. Next, you see, again, next. Then 3 of the students kind of banded together. It's kind of strange. They did it partly with my advice, but partly not. And they combined their projects with tourism, agriculture, and energy. And together they applied to the ASLA, and they won the top honor award for the year for their project, which is remarkable. I mean, they won the award, the top award for student work in areas of communication. And what they did is they took all their work, and then maybe next slide, and they made it into a book, a guidebook, which breaks into 3 parts. One to be given to, let's say, government planners. One could be given to local visitors. One could be given to government planners and energy. Next. Shows you some of the things. They did this without my guidance. I mean, this is their thing. Okay. Next. Next. And then they all went to the conference. I guess that's me with them on the stage. I'm going to read their names because I think they did well. So again, it's Jiwen Shen, who you saw. I kept showing you her photograph all the way through. Jiwei Shen as well, who is now associate professor in University of Nevada in landscape architecture, and Si Yu Jiang. 3 Chinese names. And they won the top thing. Again, I don't do studios so students can win awards, but it's kind of nice when it happens. In fact, it's just happened last week on a studio I did recently. Next, if that wasn't enough, the 2018 Winter Olympics took place. And believe it or not, the North and the South Koreans joined together as one team. And the flag that they waved is actually the peninsula. You can see it's the blue, that's the shape of the peninsula. So here we are, an instance culturally, where for one 3-week moment, the peninsula is on the flag as a unified country of North and South. So these are both North and South Korean athletes. People kind of have maybe forgotten this, but this happened. And so, in a sense, I could end with this, which of course is, kind of joyful, good news at the end. But knowing me, I can't do that. Next slide. Just after we finished, a North Korean soldier stole a Jeep. He drove a kilometer at the DMZ from the north. He was shot 8 times, but he still kept driving. He drove the the Jeep into the DMZ, actually into a guard thing, and it overturned. Injured, bleeding, he crawled into South Korea. Now he didn't crawl in where the blue huts were, so he was found by soldiers and dragged. He was taken to hospital, and he actually did recover. He survived. So in a sense, my story ends kind of with that note that it still goes on. The division still goes on. I would like to end it with a kind of, well, unification happened and everyone lived happily ever after. But life usually isn't like that. So I'm trying to suggest to you that the planning and study part of it was kind of the easy part. The reality in life, the joy of the Olympics, the despair of the North Korean soldier crawling for about 30 yards on his belly, shot and bleeding, to get into South Korea is also the reality. So, thank you. Too long. Went over. Questions? Questions?
Thank you, Niall. Yes. Questions from the crowd? We have open the floor. Any questions?
Just little details from the slide. Just saw that the DMZ zone is crossed to one lake, right? Right? It's a lake, and it's crossed in the middle of the lake. How they manage that when they cross the lake?
A water body. Yeah. And the water body actually keeps changing. That is the idea that a boundary is a line on a map. You have to dispel that. I know there are really national boundaries. I know you have boundaries to Laos, but at the end of the day, when you get on the ground, these don't exist. They are fluid. The ecology is fluid. The lake actually dries up. And so the DMZ itself, even though I've explained it to you as this somewhat fixed, inviolate, rigid thing, is constantly moving because both armies or both sides are encroaching all the time. I don't know if you read the news. Yeah, you get the news. Like you get CNN and stuff like that. A month ago, 10 North Korean soldiers were found in the DMZ right in South Korea. They actually got lost. That kind of stuff happens. It's bizarre. They were driving somewhere, they got lost, and they found themselves in South Korea. And very politely, to avoid a national incident, they kind of just sent them back. I think they gave them some T-shirts and some BTS CDs or something, which they were very grateful for, and some food. And they just sent them on their way because they just didn't want to blow things up. The other thing, I read an article a week ago, which I didn't include in this, but I'm looking for subsequent talks. there is now an industry close to the DMZ of bees, honey, the DMZ honey. And the bees, guess what the bees do? The bees don't think about boundaries, or don't think about political boundaries. They go to the north, they go to the fruit trees, and then they come back to the south. So we actually have an ecology that, you know, welcomes the absence of people, welcomes the idea of a richness of vegetation, and they will go to collect pollen for the honey, and they come back to the hives in the south, and some entrepreneurial farmer is selling DMZ honey, which I think is hilarious. I mean, I think it's great because it shows that actually in the end, nature finds ways to do things. Like, you know, the drainage thing, which I always find funny. But the idea of birds just fly right across the DMZ. Animals have a harder time. There's a lot of three-legged animals in the DMZ because they step on the landmines sometimes. A deer. I don't think there's a tiger. Maybe there's a tiger. There's all squirrels and chipmunks and things in there. So it's actually a very rich place with this terrifying history and an inability, unless any of you here have a suggestion of how the political solution can happen without resorting to more violence, more, you know, attacking nuclear offices. But the reason that Seoul has to be very delicate in the south is the DMZ is 1 hour north. A rocket from North Korea can go right into the Seoul, just like that, except they have counter rockets that go up to hit the rockets. You know, it's like, let's load up the armaments on both sides so nothing will happen. And if you probably saw the news about 3 weeks ago, there's a famine in North Korea right now. There's a lot of people dying. And so maybe that might lead to something. In the way that Vietnam is getting killed right now by the typhoons, you know. So who knows? It's probably beyond my sense and intelligence to work out how to do it. But hopefully I could have give you a sense, and for all of you who may be working on independent studies, working on thesis, working on things that you're interested in, that these types of sites, which on the surface appear too difficult, actually are worthy of your study, are worthy of your interest. And not that you're going to solve everything, but you actually can help things along a little bit, okay? And I think that's landscape architects, urban designers, planners of all types should be engaged with these types of sites.
Thank you, Neil. Do we have, oh, there's one more question. You have to be quick.
No, okay, I can give short answers.
Might be a long question, but I'm actually Chinese myself. Another possibility to the unification, in addition to just North and South Korea unifying, is that China could actually have North Korea as a province. How would you imagine if that kind of happens, the unification would like happen differently, and how landscape architect can respond to that?
That's very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, that is a good suggestion. In fact, if the war had gone slightly differently, it would be China would extend down in some form or other. And remember, in the earlier period, particularly in the 30s, and China and the West were fighting against the aggressor called Japan. You know, so times have changed and moved around. Particularly if you study history, I think that's interesting. Young Kim and Union Park did an interesting studio that kind of they did a corridor starting in Paju, just slightly below the DMZ, because you know there's actually a railway system which doesn't ever run, and it's actually the railway system to North Korea. There's a train station. You can go there and get your passport stamped. They have a guard. They have actually a train driver. They have a train. and then they have the gate down because they can't take the train. You know, they did a studio of actually doing a railway corridor from South Korea to Paris. Work that out as a landscape project, going through China, going through Russia, all the way swinging round, and then eventually ending up in Paris. I guess you could actually, no, it might even go to London because they go through the Channel in London. I mean, it was very speculative, but what it's suggesting is that things that we see as problems and boundaries between warring or not countries actually could be part of an infrastructure, in this case transportation. Now, the idea of the train wasn't to move goods, it probably was actually touristic at first, like the Orient Express, you know, the idea of taking you through 4 or 5, 6, 7 countries in 7, 8 days. But imagine if you fly here to Seoul, then you go a little bit in a bus north, you get on a train, and you take a train to London. What an experience. You know, you're on the train 8 days, but you know, hopefully you have a good seat. But I think that your proposal, your idea, your thought, is one of the ways in which I think we have to think. I think it's very smart, really smart. And I encourage you to pursue it. I have an appointment at Tsinghua University, and I'm going to make sure they know about that. Okay. Okay.
Thank you, Tony. Just to conclude, I think, just want to say some few words about Professor Niall. I would like to thank your support also in supporting students or people around you, faculty, in cultivating their ideas. I think, Niall, you have a really, from the talks that we've had, from the different lectures, a very unique perspective that you look at design. I think you're able to share that with a range of colleagues, students, Jun-Yoon Kim with the Bangkok studio, and we really want to thank you for that and sharing your time with us. I also want to congratulate you on being inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Science this year, so that's a huge honor, so maybe that's a good way to end. Thank you.
Thank you very much.